Hello, everyone. I'm Charlotte Gibson. I'm president of Charlottesville Now, and I want to welcome everyone to part 2 of our commemoration of the 19th Amendment, Her Story, Her Voice, Voting and Racial Injustice. I want to thank our Vice President for Action and Programs, Kathy Falzer, for putting together our great program tonight. And then I'm going to get the slides going. So before we start, we at Charlottesville Now want to acknowledge the devastating loss of feminist icon and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Kathy will share a statement from National Now, and afterward, in honor of RBG, we'll observe a moment of silence to reflect on the contributions she made toward women's equality and improving the lives of all Americans.
Thanks, Charlotte. As Charlotte said, this is the statement from National Now. There aren't sufficient words to describe the depth of sorrow women are feeling at the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We are shattered. We are broken. We feel that we have lost more than a dear and admired friend. Our country has lost a feminist champion. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not only a historic Supreme Court justice, but also a political and cultural icon for the ages and a feminist legend. She fought for and protected women's rights every day. Now recognizes all that she contributed to women and girls, to America, to our world, in terms of equality and possibilities. Now's work is an extension of amazing leaders, amazing women, amazing sheroes like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That she did her work in the face of sexism throughout her life, and while battling cancer in the last chapters of her life, speaks to the power of showing up, of enduring, of advocating no matter what. Justice Ginsburg's spirit, her soul, and her power will be with us forever. So I'd like us all to take a moment of silence and reflect on the contributions, the many contributions she made to improve our life here in America and in the world. Thank you. And now we must commit to working to ensure RBG's achievements are not diminished and to fulfill her most fervent wish, as she expressed it to her daughter, that she would not be replaced until a new president is installed. Charlotte?
All right, my slides are not advancing. There we go. Something tangible we can do to honor the memory of RBG is to donate a book or two to the Jefferson-Madison Regional Library as part of Charlottesville Now's annual Feminist Book Drive, a tradition we started on Women's Equality Day in 2013. It's worth noting tonight that the very first book we donated was Grace and Grit, My Fight for Equal Pay and Fairness at Goodyear and Beyond by Lilly Ledbetter. In Ledbetter's case, RBG issued a scathing and historic dissent, calling out her male colleagues for their indifference to the pay discrimination experienced by women. It was this dissent that became the impetus for Ledbetter to continue her fight and for Congress to pass the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. So we invite everyone to join us to ensure her story is included in the library's collection, Note that some new titles have been added and are highlighted here. You see the library's wish link and details in the chat. We're thrilled that after last month's event, the donation tally was 26 books and counting. If you've donated books since August 25th or wish to do so tonight, please note that in the chat. Note the book titles or the number of books you've already purchased or that you pledged to buy. We'll share the grand total at the end of our meeting tonight. Kathy?
Thanks, Charlotte. And speaking of HerStory, before we start tonight's program, I wanted to make sure that you are all aware of an upcoming program we at Charlottesville Now are planning. We are still negotiating the date, but we are planning on hosting Elise Hogue, the president of NARAL, to discuss her new book, The Lie That Binds. Public support for the legal right to abortion in the United States is at an all-time high, yet we're in the midst of an all-out assault on reproductive freedom, and Roe v. Wade is hanging by a thread only made more relevant by the passing of RBG. Hogue's book reveals how this formerly nonpartisan issue became the spear point of the conservative political machinery designed to thwart social progress on a number of issues. It explains how abortion was intentionally targeted to become a rallying cry for conservatives, becoming a Trojan horse to move a very unpopular regressive agenda under the guise of morality. This deeply researched investigation shows how this drives politics and threatens our democracy. And I promise we'll post the date just as soon as we have one and get you and advise you of our plans. So now I'd like to move on to our program tonight. Last month, we celebrated Women's Equality Day and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that won women the right to vote. Mary Julianne, who co-authored the Campaign for Women's Suffrage in Virginia, regaled us with stories of the Virginia women who worked so hard to win voting rights for all women nationwide. But afterward, even with the 19th Amendment, many were still unable to vote. State laws disenfranchised most African Americans, and it would still take the civil rights movement of the 1960s before all Blacks in the South could vote. And yet still voter suppression is a concern today. Tonight, our panelists will discuss the years from the Civil War to 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, the Jim Crow years, when many gains were lost prior to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the voter suppression efforts that continue today. They will share local action efforts and ways you can help ensure that the political power earned by women in 1920 is accessible to all today and in the future. Three wonderful local speakers will lead our discussion tonight. Dr. Andrea Douglas from the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, Leslie Harris Scott from the Albemarle Charlottesville NAACP, and Miss Ella Washington Jordan from the 100 Black Women of the Charlottesville metro area. Each will have 15-20 minutes to speak, and after all have presented, we'll open it up to Q&A. In the interest of time, you can submit your questions via the chat feature during the presentations. Dr. Andrea Douglas is Executive Director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. Douglas holds an MA and PhD in art history from the University of Virginia and an MBA in arts management and finance from Binghamton University in New York. She has also participated in the Getty Leadership Institute. Douglas was curator of collections and exhibitions and curator of contemporary art at the University of Virginia Art Museum from 2004 to 2010. She has taught graduate and undergraduate classes in African American, contemporary, and art theory, and has published exhibition catalogs and scholarly articles. Douglas's scholarship considers the cultural and social connections in the biographies of 20th and 21st century artists of the African diaspora. She has been a chair of the city's Place Design Task Force and a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race and Monuments, the UVA President's Commission on Slavery at the university, where she sat on their Monument and Community Outreach Committee. Presently, Douglas sits on Monticello's Advisory Committee on African American Affairs and was recently appointed to co-chair of the next President's Commission, which will explore the university's post-emancipation policy history. She also sits on the board of the Miller School of Albemarle and on the Emily Couric Leadership Forum Board. Dr. Douglas, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm gonna need to share my screen and then I'll get started. So my goal tonight is to, in 15 minutes, talk about the earliest history. The title of the talk is Considering the Implications of the 15th and 19th Amendments. And so we're able to address both the beginning of voting in Charlottesville for African-American people, and then also have a conversation about how women's role in that fact. So, so I want to begin with a conversation about the first Black vote. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 required that all the former Confederate states, except Tennessee, which had already ratified the 14th Amendment, to hold constitutional conventions. And it's the consequence of that, but Black men were enfranchised for the delegate selection and ratified ballots. 75% of the African-American male population voted in Virginia. In Charlottesville, the African-American community was very, very active very early on in its desire to engage in the vote. And it's in so much so, it presented a series of demands to those delegates that would then go on to the convention. And I'm really interested in sort of thinking about those demands, because as you look through it, we must never again be deprived of the vote. Very early on, understanding what that meant. No man should be prevented from holding office or sitting on a jury on account of color. There should be a uniform system of common schools open to all, supported by general tax. In 1867, when they're making these discussions, the Jefferson School has already been open, but public schools are not open in this area until 1870. So to be having those kinds of conversations, these are all precursors of a kind of notion of desire. The rule of law and evidence apply to all persons alike. Laws of ejectment and restraint should protect equally the landlord and the tenant. So please, you can't kick us out of our homes. Corporal punishment for crime should not be inflicted. Number 7 is what I think is particularly interesting, is that in 1867, they're talking about the poll tax and that no poll tax should be levied for any purpose. That has a lot to do with not so much what's going on in Virginia, but what's going on in other parts of the South, where the poll tax has already begun to be used as a way of disenfranchising Black people, in particular Black men. And then the final one, that all decisions should be made by ballot. Now, at this moment, when you're thinking that 75% of the Black male population in the South in particular are voting for these amendments, number 7 will become very important. In Charlottesville, there was a committee elected of 6 leading men. Among them included James T.S. Taylor, who was part of this committee. And James T.S. Taylor would then go on, and this is an image of he and his wife. He would then go on to be represent Albemarle County at the Constitutional Convention. He's born to free parents. He served in the United States Colored Troops during the American Civil War. He's described as a radical, and he won the election in 1867 as one of the county's 2 delegates to the convention. In subsequent years, he ran twice for a seat in the House of Delegates, but he lost both times. Taylor remained a prominent member of Charlottesville's African-American community well into the 20th century. He died of pneumonia in his home in 1918. Now, deliberations at that convention in Richmond included conversations about universal suffrage. Black women, now free, wanted to vote just like their men. And this image here is an image of the 15th Amendment. It's from Baltimore. It's showing that moment when the 15th Amendment was passed. It was passed in 1870, and officially granted African-American men the right to vote by declaring that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And as I said, this is from Harper's Weekly, and it does represent that moment in Baltimore. Just to give you a little bit of description of the image, you're looking at on your screen on the very left, right, sort of in, I'm pointing and you can't see me point. Let me stop pointing. You can see that there are 2 pillars there. You know, there are 3 arches, and then there are pillars to those arches. On one hand, it's education, and the other is science. And, you know, an image certainly of aspiration, of the notion that receiving the right to vote will then move to the representation of African Americans of ability to participate in community and in ideology. So this is an image of Isabella Gibbons, and I want to point to her because when I said that African-American women were equally as excited about the opportunity to vote, it's through her figure that we get the first indications of that in her biography. We know most about her because of her writings in the Freedmen's Aid Society papers. As a teacher of the Jefferson School, she was hired by the Freedmen's Aid Society and had to monthly give a report. And it's through that report that we understand what her activities were. And she speaks a lot about going to the Republican Party meetings. We also know that she was part of the temperance movement, which is the sort of early precursor to the suffragist movement. And so as a figure, she is considered to be one of authority in the African-American community. And as a teacher, having a lot of influence in that regard, because this is the image of the first graduating class of the Jefferson School. And Isabella Gibbons is, she's second from the left in the very top row, holding that diploma. And why she's so significant is that she's surrounded by male and female students who are learning at the Jefferson School and very much aware of the politics of the time. So as you're starting to think about what role did women play in 1867 in this very early moment, number one, they're in Richmond, right? And they are advising their men about what their votes ought to be. And they're also teaching not just young children, but they're also teaching older people at that same time. When Anna Gardner comes to Charlottesville, she says that and Anna Gardner is the woman sitting down with the big hoop skirt. She says, let a school be open and scholars from 6 to 60 years old will come. So these early teachers at the Jefferson School, Isabella Gibbons, is not just teaching youngsters, she's also influencing the ideas of older men. And such is the case as you begin to start to think about the role of women. What I'm trying to describe here is, at the moment of universal suffrage, how do you understand what roles they're playing in the background? How are they moving their community forward? This is an image of Nanny Cox Jackson, 1865 to 1953. Right next to her, what I'm showing is a deed. And I'm not sure you can see it, and I'm hoping that you can, but that deed is one of the earliest deeds signed in Charlottesville. It's signed by Nanny Cox Jackson in 1888. And it's the cost of purchasing a home for $105, right? And in today's numbers, that's translating about $2,781. But what I'm representing by showing this deed is really the ability to sign the document, suggests that that she was also considered to, like other men, to be a prominent woman in the community, a prominent person in the business community. And in her lifetime, Nanny Cox Jackson would be one of the wealthier property owners in Charlottesville. She would be a teacher at the Jefferson School, and she wielded her social influence for the betterment of her community. And as you start to sort of chart the role of women, you'll begin to see that African-American women in the Black middle class in particular are actually playing a very similar role to white women, that they are joining clubs, and it's through these organizations that they're beginning to influence the ways in which the community moves forward. So in terms of the sort of histories that we're looking at, there is a period in 1890. You've got a period that is the Reconstruction period, right? The Reconstruction period lasts until about 1870. There is a period of the readjuster period that gives way to the Redeemer period. And the Redeemer period is about 1888, well into then what becomes the 1902 Constitution. There are some historians who describe, for African Americans, they describe this as the Nadir period, N-A-D-I-R. And it's the Nadir period because this is the moment that you begin to see much of the violence against African American people that will ultimately result in the limiting of their abilities to vote, or even their desire to vote. So in this particular period, you begin to understand that Southern whites are setting about to ensure the systematic disenfranchisement of Black male vote. The use of racial terror lynchings, the poll tax, literacy tests effectively curtail the capacity of Black men to participate in public office. The increase in racial terror activity in particular, in 1898, you've got 200 people killed in Tennessee as a consequence of white mob violence. In our own town, in 1898, you've got the lynching of John Henry James. And what I'm showing you is this letter written by Florence Bishop, which we uncovered as we were doing the work to describe the lynching of John Henry James. And it's a really telling letter being written by a woman who is articulating very clearly the sentiment of the town, in our town. She's, you know, at one point she says something like, that she talks about the idea that we were forced to give African Americans education and then the right to vote, and this is what they do, they rape our women. So ultimately, I'm showing this letter to really to sort of articulate where we are in the 1890s in Charlottesville and how we understand it's not just a ideology held by men, but it's also an ideology held by women. That this sort of notion of Blacks as inferior. And it is that notion that will also impact the 1902 convention that leads to the rewriting of the 1868 Constitution. The 1868 Constitution allows Virginia back into the United States, and the 1902 Constitution, as it's written, is the Constitution that is meant directly to turn back all of the gains of that 1868 Constitution and all of the gains that African Americans have made during the Reconstruction period. So the Constitution across the South and all the constitutions that are voted in within that early 20th century period inculcate the notion of the poll tax. The poll tax at one point was part of the way America received taxes. It was originally called a head tax. But during this period, the poll tax then becomes a tool for disenfranchisement, specifically targeted at Black men who had been engaged as a consequence of universal suffrage. What I'm showing you is an image of George Inge. George Inge was a very early on a member, chairman of the, you can see it in the pay bill there, chairman of the Republican Party. But by 1901 though, the white Republicans would say that they want their party back. The letter specifically says that they want to return to a lily white party. And so the gains of the readjuster movement, which was at that point a bipartisan movement, which caused African Americans to have homes, better health care, mental health care, really sort of moving education forward, is now being redressed by 1902. This playbill suggests that it becomes even more concentrated by 1901. And in 1901, a committee of African Americans go to the Luray Convention, where they're going to vote on the candidates to go to Richmond, and they're turned away from that convention. So by 1901, you're already beginning to see complete disenfranchisement of Black men. They are not seated. Hang on. I keep losing my connection here. Okay. So this is an article from the Daily Progress that is about the 1902 Constitution. And the 1902 Constitution is, as I said, the Constitution that completely redresses all of the gains. And so in order to register to vote, you have first had to served in war in the Army or Navy of the United States or the Confederate States or of any state, right? So you can already see that that is going to reduce significantly the number of Black men who are going to vote. We know that in Charlottesville, Albemarle County, there were 250 men who participated in the Civil War, whether in the Confederacy. But those people were enslaved people. They were not necessarily considered soldiers at that time. And a person, a son of any such person. So by now, in 1902, we've moved beyond I'll move on. I've lost that word. So this is the conditions under which people can vote, right? There are implications of that, though, for Charlottesville, is that in 1902, the number of Black men who are able to vote in Charlottesville, according to the Daily Progress, which this slide shows, is just 85. If you think about it this way, at the end of the Civil War, the majority of people in the city of Charlottesville were Black. 52% of the population were Black. If you did some math and you said, okay, let's half that and take out all the women, you're at about 7,500. If you half that again and you say you're going to take the children out, and you even bring yourself down to 2,000 potential men to vote, the implications of the poll tax and the literacy test and of racial violence leads us with 85 people who are able to, Black men who are able to vote in 1902. That's a significant reduction in the capacity of African-American people to participate in the governance of the city and in the governance of the state. And these names are the actual names that are listed in the Daily Progress. Most of these people are part of the Black middle class. Most of these people will have, through their involvement in the Piedmont industrial land improvement, through their involvement as teachers, through their involvement as laborers, will have put away enough money that they are then able to pay a poll tax. Now, a poll tax, if you is something that needs to be paid 3 years, subsequent years in a row, right? At that point, it's $1.50, and it will be $1.50 for quite some time. But $1.50 in today's money is about $400. And so if you're thinking about whether or not to, you know, pay for an illness, to pay for any damage to a home, $400 to a family becomes quite significant, and even if we're thinking about it in modern time. The idea of paying that $400 for every 3 years in order to then be able to vote, and then once you get to that place where you're able to register, your capacity to vote is then mitigated by the literacy test. The literacy test that then said you would have to be able to interpret some amendment of the Constitution. Interestingly enough, most people who are administering that test, they themselves can't, have no capacity to do that. So have no idea whether a Black man is telling you the correct interpretation or not. So it's through these kind of machinations that male suffrage is limited. Now, as we continue through, and as I said, Black women are working to influence their communities largely through groups. And one of the documents that we use at the Heritage Center to sort of articulate that is the petition that leads to the founding of the Jefferson School. That petition that's being given in 1920, largely written, signed by women, individual women from the Black middle class, but also women who are part of social groups. And we have not yet been able to identify every single one of those groups, but we know that this is the way that they're operating. They're operating through community aid programs. You know, you hear us talk often about the Daughters of Zion. It's community aid programs such as that where women are participating, that are moving communities forward. How much time do I have? Am I gone too long? So when we think about white women, though, the suffragist movement, women were very, very resentful of the inclusion of men in the 14th Amendment and the failure of the 15th Amendment to extend the right to vote to women. The movement begins as early as 1870 in Virginia, but it takes up real steam after the passing of the 1902 Constitution. This movement is led by the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. It's organized in 1909. It's the precursor to the Virginia League of Women Voters. And by 1915, the anti-suffragists are openly exploiting racial fear. This is a playbill from 1916 that you're looking at. And this is not to say that the entirety of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia was racist, but what I'm saying is that most of these women came from an elite social class. They believed wholeheartedly in the division of race. They saw their relationship to African American women as in some ways charitable, so that their actions and their ability to vote, they would use that activity to uplift the Black race. And so what I find interesting about this playbill is that it really articulates the position of some members of the equal suffrage movement in relationship to race. They're using the notion of the poll tax as a mechanism to convince white men that they should vote for the 19th Amendment, suggesting that although there is a poll tax, for instance, there is so much, it says here, because there are 191,000 more white women of voting age in Virginia than there are Negro women of voting age. And while women outnumber Negro men and women put together by 31,407. So the enfranchisement of Virginia women would increase white supremacy, all right? Because the Constitution further says that the General Assembly may prescribe a property qualification of not exceeding $250 for voters in the county, this is a provision to be used if needed, but it has never been needed anywhere in Virginia, for there is no county or city or town where Negro men qualify in larger numbers than white men. They are not. They are shut out by the present restrictions. We are secure from Negro domination now, then, evermore. And so this is a sort of position that is being taken in order to ensure the possibility of white women vote. Now, what we know in Charlottesville is that in 1920, in the minute that African American women did receive the opportunity to vote, women of the Black middle class did sign up. We have the rolls. I went in, our registrar, our former registrar, is an amazing woman. She maintains those books. I went in and I copied all of the pages of the colored books. And so we have a record of the women on September 20th, 1920, who signed up. And their names are Tonsler, Coles. They really represent those women who were leaders. The interesting part of that is that the poll tax still plays here, because although they register to vote, they have to pay the poll tax for 3 years. So in fact, they don't get to participate until 1923. Now, if you understand how this all plays itself out, think about someone with a household of now it's the wife and the husband, and as is typical, you have a child of voting age. This is now a household that is paying a poll tax equal to, as I said, in today's numbers, almost $1,200, right? If you really think about it. So the poll tax becomes a very, very important tool. Now, the poll tax was never actually meant only for Blacks. It also applied to poor whites as well. The difference, though, is that the Democratic Party in the South would pay the poll tax for whites. It would ensure that whites were able to vote, where that was not done for Blacks. And so the poll tax holds relevance in our lives well into the 20th century, because it's not until the Voting Rights Act that the poll tax is declared unconstitutional. So how do we understand how African American women in particular continue to ensure that that enfranchisement occurs, that Black people are able to participate in elections and to hold office? It is really, again, continuing to make sure that their voices are heard. Those who are able to vote and able to afford to vote, we see their names show up over and over and over in the registration rolls. They continue to participate. And it really is the formation ultimately of the NAACP, which you all will talk about later, where you begin to see an active drive in this community towards voter participation. And that's led largely by women in this community. It's women who are doing that, that heavy lifting, that heavy work. This is an image, as I talked about, of the list of women who signed the Jefferson School petition. And you can see one of the names is Ferguson. There, you see Mrs. Inge there, you see the Edwards, you see the Barber. These are the women that are really engaged in moving the community forward. And then on the other image is of the colored rolls that I talked about, where we're seeing that people are signing up to vote. So yeah, that's where I leave off. Thank you very much. This is another thing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrea, so much. Very sobering and full of information as always. And encouraging to hear of the women's role and how important they were and continue to be to the voting effort.
Okay. No, I think that's you know, as you begin to sort of thread this all together, the reason why I started out with Isabella Gibbons is to really sort of put that space. Although that women are not able to vote yet, they are very influential in the decisions that their husbands are making in that very early piece. They are engaged, they are involved, and they remain politically active from day one till today.
That's great. Thank you so much for all of that.
Sure.
Really valuable information. Let me see. At this point, we'll move on to next we have Leslie Harris Scott, mental health therapist at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women and the first vice president of the Albemarle Charlottesville branch of the NAACP. Leslie Harris Scott is a native of Charlottesville and attended Charlottesville Public Schools. She holds degrees in psychology from the University of Virginia and human services counseling from Old Dominion University. She completed her graduate degree studies in counselor education from the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education and has worked as a mental health professional ever since. In the past, she has worked in her community as a counselor for youth at Teen Site, a social worker at both the Charlottesville and Albemarle County Departments of Social Services, and as a mental health professional in the Access Division of the Region 10 Community Services Board. Leslie presently serves as the first vice president of the Albemarle Charlottesville NAACP and as a board member and past chair of the Barrett Early Learning Center. In the past, she has also served on many community boards such as AHIP, Weed and Seed Network, the African American Cultural Arts Festival, and as a commissioner on the Commission on Children and Families. Ms. Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, Dr. Douglas, that was wonderful. There's so much history there I didn't even know. So I thank you so much for your expertise in that area. I bring greetings from the Albemarle Charlottesville chapter of the NAACP here in Charlottesville. I don't have as much history except that there was a large role played by the NAACP, which began here in Charlottesville from Benjamin F. Bunn, Reverend Bunn at First Baptist Church, and his wife, Mrs. Imogene Bunn. And there was a lot that took place over the years. And so if we have time during our Q&A, I hope that Dr. Douglas can bring some in if she has some of that. My focus is on the NAACP's Our Vote, Our Voice. And I wanted to make sure that we understand we need to mobilize millions to ensure the highest turnout ever. We know from John Lewis that one of his famous quotes is that, I've said this before and I'll say it again, the vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democracy. And that's for men and women, but especially for us as women in an era when they are trying to defund Planned Parenthood, when the Affordable Care Act is in danger. There's so much at risk and at stake. And so regardless of race, we have to continue to educate people around us. We have 42 days left, but that's still plenty of time for us to organize and to motivate and educate people. And so I just wanted to encourage you all to know your plan and make sure that you are registered to vote. That is what the NAACP is pushing nationally, is to know what our plan is. How are you going to vote? Maybe get a partner to go with or something like that. And then also to know where you're supposed to vote and make sure you are registered. I wanted to share some information from the NAACP's website. We know that if people of color and specifically Black voters participated in elections at the same rates as white voters have, we would have a progressive majority. Black voters are skeptical of the political establishment, unhappy with candidate choices, frustrated with structural and institutional racism, slow job growth, no wage growth, the rising cost of healthcare, the rising cost of college, and the rising cost of housing, and disturbed about police violence. We can address many of these issues by electing the right individuals and passing the right legislation. So again, I encourage everyone to vote. I wanted to share a little bit about the Voting Rights Act just to kind of take off where Dr. Douglas left. And again, this is very brief in the essence of time so that we do have time at the end to be able to talk with one another and share just ideas or thoughts that we have and how we can impact our community. Despite the fact that African Americans and other racial and ethnic minority Americans are guaranteed the right to vote by the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was passed just after the Civil War in 1870, states and local municipalities continued to use tactics such as poll taxes and literacy tests, which Dr. Douglas spoke of, and outright intimidation to stop people from casting free and unfettered ballots. And we're still seeing that today. We still see a lot of individuals who are intimidated at the voting when they go to vote, individuals who've been incarcerated. They are not aware that they have the right to apply and have their rights restored. Those are important ways that people are kept from voting. And so we have to educate people. We have to have the knowledge. We have to let the word be out. And so my focus, I know locally what we're doing is we've had the youth and the Youth Commission and chapter. We just recently got started at NAACP and here in Charlottesville and all, but in areas around us in Virginia, we've had the youth to even do contactless passing out of information, even to make sure people are registered to vote. The voter registration drives, very important. And also just talking, just word of mouth. One of the things that's really important amongst us as humans, but especially in the African American culture, is word of mouth, talking, that oral history. of telling why it's important to vote, why our people went through what they went through, and how they got over, and how we still aren't there. We still have a lot to do. And so I just want to encourage people to take the time to know their history, to know why it's important to vote. And in these last 42 days, we have got to exercise our right as women and as African Americans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That's great information that we can all use. Like you said, 42 days before the election, going into this election, it's so important. Up next, Ella Washington Jordan, Chief of Staff at United Way of Greater Charlottesville and President of 100 Black Women of the Charlottesville metro area. Ella holds a Bachelor of Science in Management and Leadership from Bluefield College. She is a native of Albemarle County and before retiring, served for 30 years as the clerk of the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors. Ella has served as the outreach director for several congressional campaigns and a statewide primary campaign. She brings a can-do attitude, a sense of humor and ease at interacting with a diverse spectrum of constituencies. Very involved in her community, Ella has also served on the NAACP Executive Board and the Charlottesville Scholarship Program. Board of Directors, and currently serves as the president of 100 Black Women of the Charlottesville Metropolitan area. Ella, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. And and I have learned so much from Andrea and from Leslie. And I mean, it's just been amazing. So just thank you. So when I was asked to talk, it's interesting because my experience has probably been in some ways different from a lot of other African Americans. And I say that because I've always been involved in the political process in some way or the other and have never been intimidated. So one of the things that I decided to do was to ask people how they felt when they went to the polls, but also the people who volunteer and some of the workers. And I also learned quite a bit because I served as the executive director for the Albemarle County Democratic Party for a year. So it was quite interesting, my experiences there. But also when I worked on these congressional campaigns, but also when I worked for the Board of Supervisors. And so one of the questions that I was asked about was about attempts to squelch the African American vote here. And so, like I said, I asked several people who volunteered at polls what their thought was and how they felt. If there was any attempts to do that. And it was quite interesting, the reactions that I got from African Americans and what I got from white people. Because from the volunteers, people that, in one of my responsibilities when working for the Democratic Party was to get volunteers at polls and at the various precincts. And so it was that everybody is welcome. But I want you to think about this. As an older African American, and I think about this because of a conversation that I had with my grandmother before she passed away. If you are an 85 or a 90-year-old African American woman, how do you think they feel if they go to the poll and everybody that's standing out there, nobody looks like them? There is an aspect of intimidation there. And so so when they're approached or not approached, they feel a certain way. People feel a certain way. And one of the things that I have seen is that while here in the Charlottesville and the Albemarle area, there is a different atmosphere. But as somebody who's traveled all over the state of Virginia, when I was working with these campaigns, I saw differences there. There was intimidation at some of these places down further south. I will tell you that an experience in Appomattox, when I was told, regardless, not to be there at some of these places after when it got dark. And I was actually told this back in about 4 or 5 years ago, that it wouldn't be good for me. But you know, my focus here was on this area here in Charlottesville. And while some of, you know, the average person and most of us don't see this happening here, it is happening in other places. What I'm finding, and it's probably because of the work that I did, most people are saying that everybody is encouraged, that, you know, nobody is intimidated, but they are. It's implicit. I mean, it might not be what it might not appear to be, but if you think about it, when you go to every polling place, what do most people see? Now, we need volunteers. You have to get everybody that you possibly can to volunteer. And very few in the African American community volunteer at the polls, unless they are in an area that is majority African American. One place that I saw more African Americans at was at last year, I believe it was, at Yancey School. That had the largest number of African American volunteers. Not only were people there inside the polling place, but outside the polling place, the workers and the volunteers. Now, what that tells me, in which I know because I'm aware of this community, is because it's a large African American community. So if you think about this, the way that the lines are drawn, the way that the districts are drawn, it almost makes you wonder, is it almost deliberate? And so, but in going back to some of the questions that I was asked, it is, to me, it's welcoming, but it's because I think that is my expectation. But when I talk to certain people, and especially elderly people, because what I decided to do was to reach out to people that I knew and who actually go and then volunteers at the polls. And like I said, the conversation that I had and that I received was two different ones. And it's how people really think and what they see. And very seldom what I found was that older African Americans do feel intimidated. And they do feel that when they're asked to present their ID or something. I remember having this conversation with my grandmother and her saying, well, I don't have to have my ID when I go to the bank because they all know me. But so if I go to vote, if they know me, I have to show my ID. So there is something there. And there are a number of people that feel that. Now, the younger generation do not see that and do not feel that same angst when they go and vote. One of the things in terms of, that's why I say volunteering is definitely so important. And it also gives a sense of security to people when they go, and especially if they see somebody that they know or somebody that looks like them. As I traveled around to the polls when I was working for the Democratic Party last year, and one of the things I did was go to pretty much every site in Albemarle County. And even there are certain places that when I went, and so I'll take, for example, when I was in Scottsville, and at the time when I went there, I was the only Black person there. And so even standing out there, and even in the role that I had, there was, there were people who looked at me as if, what are you doing here? So if I can feel that, and if I can see that, imagine somebody who doesn't know the system and hasn't been involved as much as I do. I don't know of people who have been turned away. For the most part, what I'm seeing and what I have seen and found is that, if people want to vote, they can vote, and which is great. The other thing is that I see that it's so important to, I don't know how important it is to have, one of the questions I was asked about was in terms of a lawyer at the polls. There needs to be somebody around with a legal mind and with a knowledge. As long as you know that there is somebody that can be reached if something happens. It is so important. But having somebody there to oversee and to see what is going on and to add that comfort to people, that is what is necessary. And I'll go back again to volunteers, and I don't think that we put as much emphasis to get a wide range of people, especially Black people, to volunteer at polls. And I will say, I don't put it all on white people to do this. I think it is something that is important for all of us to do. And so it is necessary to have people there, to have as many volunteers there, and to just monitor and see everything that is going on. I think about when I was down, you think about other places, and like I said, wow, here, it really is, the atmosphere is quite different than if you go somewhere like Lunenburg. There is a whole different atmosphere. And the African American vote is not there as much as it is here. And while you can have a community like that, that's larger. The African American community can be larger there, but the vote is not there because they don't feel, there are people who some of them don't feel safe going. And I know that from conversations. But there's also, and this is something that Leslie had spoken about, is that the feeling that your vote is not going to make that much of a difference or have that impact in terms of how is it going to impact me and how is it really going to impact my community. It's not going to make any difference. And so that is something that we really do have to get past and somehow figure out how to improve it, and not in just this community, because this is a very highly educated community. And I don't have to tell not only the African American, but everyone within this community. And so, of course, the more educated you are, the more you are going to go to the polls and vote and so forth. So, but I also want to say that I talked to some precinct workers, and like I said, they all said, oh no, everybody is free. We don't have any kind of problems. But again, it's interesting how people feel differently. And so I also think it is incumbent upon us to figure out how do we change that so that everybody feels as comfortable. And that's about it.
Thank you so much, Ella. Thank you so much to all three of you. There's just so much information and so many challenges laid out for us going forward to making sure that everyone feels comfortable and franchised, that going to the poll will make a difference. Thank you so much for a fascinating evening. Now we're going to turn to the audience's questions. If you have not already submitted your questions, please add them in the chat now. And Charlotte?
Let me see what we have in the chat. Okay, I have another question to everyone. When did the poll tax end?
So it's the Voting Rights Act of 1965 makes the poll tax unlawful. And in so doing, it refers back to sort of articulating the documents of the 15th Amendment, where it says that no one should be kept from voting as a consequence of race. So that's what the Voting Rights Act really did. And some other things too, but that's when it was. Yeah.
Okay, here's another question in the chat. How much difference does it make if candidates are African American in getting a larger Black vote? Is there a greater Black turnout for voting if the candidate is African American? What do you all think? Ella, you might
I don't know that.
have a comment on that. Go ahead.
Sure, I will say this, that after having worked for a number of candidates, it can make a difference. We all know that former President Obama made the biggest difference in getting African Americans to the polls, and that was the biggest one. And there are times that yes, they do. It all depends on the candidate.
I also think it depends on the issues at hand as well. I mean, I think that we're in an age that, you know, Biden's choice for Kamala Harris is deliberate. It is with an intention of reaching a population that has been in support of a Democratic candidacy since the 1950s, 1960s. You know, I think about something like a Cameron Webb. You know, when Cameron first started talking about his vote, he was talking about, you know, that 13% in the South, in this more southern area where he's from, that because of his particular platform, and then also being able to sort of attract voters in those areas where he's from that had not been part of the earlier district campaign. There's got to be something about the fact that he's a Black man from that area who is speaking about public health in the way that he's speaking about public health that will resonate. So I think there is something about where we are right now, and the necessity to engage in some real conversations about things like healthcare. You know, that's what we care about, and it's an important part of I think an African American platform even. But I only know about my vote. I'm not a sort of a political expert in that way.
I think Leslie wants to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that a lot of it has to do with the issues, because where we are, our power lies in how things are going to affect you, the person. So if you're going to take away Planned Parenthood and you're going to take away Affordable Care Act, you're not getting my vote. I don't care if you're pink, you're not getting my vote. You know what I'm saying? So I think we all have that human side to us. And also, it is our vote. We have the power for our vote. Our vote does count. And so that means something. And so we have to really take it really seriously. And when we're educating others, in the African American community, there are a lot of people who were not for Kamala Harris at first because she was a prosecutor in the past, and because of the differences in the way things went for African Americans in the judicial system. But I think she's done a great job of expressing her thoughts, what she wants to do, and I think she and Biden make an excellent team. And again, that's just my opinion. But I know I've talked to people who were like, oh no, she was a prosecutor. So I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about that. So again, this is an opportunity for us to value that vote, and for us to talk about it with people, to educate them in this, to hear other opinions, you know?
So this leads, there's another question that this leads right into. Someone writes, from watching TV, I saw the enthusiasm that African American women felt about Kamala Harris. Are Black men as excited as women are about the ticket? What do y'all think?
I have no real idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I will say this. I was talking to a young man who, and this is interesting. He is about 35 years old, and he actually wasn't that crazy about her. Then he found out, then when he did some more research on her and found out she's from a historical Black college. And so then he came back and he said, well, there must be something to her. That if she went to a historical Black college. And so my question then was, what made her different when listening to her, when she was running, you know, when she was one of the candidates running, and now? And of course and his response was that I'm going to support her. And there are a couple of other people that I've had conversations with, and granted, they're not a large number, but yes, you know, they felt that it was good because of the fact that it was a Black woman. Now, even though she wasn't the one running for president, but they supported her for the fact that she's the VP. Which I found interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Okay, I have another question here. Do felons still have to get a letter from the government to get back their vote?
It's a process that you go through, And Virginia Organizing Project is big on that. And I think legal aid, I can't remember, it's been so long since I helped with that, but there's a gentleman at legal aid, Harold Foley, and he would know. I know he's helped some people in the community to get their rights back. So it is a process. It takes a little bit of time. Like you wouldn't be able to do it in the 42 days now, but it's a process, but it's also a great learning process from my talk with individuals. And there's pride in the ones that now have their right to vote. There is pride because they have served their time and they have that opportunity. And it's not all felons. There's certain criteria. I think it depends.
Right. I did see somewhere that it takes about 6 weeks, I think, and that there was a September 23rd. If you had it in by September 23rd, you might still get to vote this year.
Oh.
Which would be extraordinary. But I think the process is much easier than it used to be. The form and so forth is much easier than it used to be.
It is. And believe it or not, you can actually do the form. And I know this because I helped someone to do it on the internet.
Yes.
And we actually went through the process and did it. And this was a couple of years ago, the first time I helped somebody, and they got it. You know, they got their rights restored. But it's like what Leslie said, it actually has to do with the type of felony that you have.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just looking through the chat to see if we have any more questions. Does anybody else have a question? If not, we'll wrap up. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and participating in this important conversation. And a very special thank you to our panelists who so very generously gave of their time and expertise. Give them a round of applause.